Now, let's discuss Blinken shuttle diplomacy with Daniel Levy, the president of the US Middle East Project. Good to see you, Daniel. Thank you. At best, what can come out of this? In a sense, when you have the US that is not prepared to go along with the Arab countries' call for a ceasefire, preferring to call it a pause or a humanitarian pause, where even that seems unlikely. So what purpose do you think it serves?
It's an important question, Richard. I think it's eminently reasonable to say that after the attack on Israel on October 7th, Israel had to take action. Now, I think many people who Secretary Blinken has met with in the region would say, listen, first of all, Mr. Secretary, this is the neglect of years of allowing the Palestinians to live without their rights and freedoms, and we need to address that. But okay, we understand that happens after. Number two, Mr. Secretary, you don't resolve these issues militarily. Hamas is an armed movement, but it's also a political movement that won elections. It's also an idea. Oppressed people take up arms. Now, they can't violate international law. So, Mr. Secretary, remember history across the world. Right. This isn't just about Muslim movements. But third, Mr. Secretary, in refusing to call for a ceasefire, you know what? After one day, after 3 days, after a week, you could say that the Israelis are going to get this right. They're not going to cause civilian casualties. But now the proof is in. With every day, the toll on civilians gets more horrific. You can't hide behind the excuses anymore. There are 7 times more Palestinian children killed in this assault than Ukrainian children killed in 20 months in the Russian military campaign. So I think what they're trying to do is strengthen the arguments on the American side to move beyond this very low bar pause, which they're not even achieving, and to up the ante
Daniel,
on whether it's in private diplomacy to get a ceasefire.
Okay, so assuming that to be their position, the failure of the US to put greater pressure, if you will, on Netanyahu and the Israelis, even assuming if they did, the Israelis would give in to such pressure, because that's also the core question here. There's no point in the US putting pressure if they know that Netanyahu has absolutely no intention of following that line. That merely weakens the US position.
Well, that's important. So I think what this means is, can you get the correct mix between the public and private messaging? If there's too much of a gap, the Israelis know they can play in that position. So I don't think the Americans have sufficiently tested how far they can push Israel. Of course, America has tremendous leverage. Does it want to use it? There are divisions on the Israeli side. Yes, the desire for revenge is overwhelming, but Netanyahu is incredibly unpopular. And then there's this other factor, Richard, which could be the path out of this, which is the prisoners being held in Gaza, including American citizens. And so when the secretary and the American officials talk to Qatar, also perhaps when they're going to be in Ankara talking to the leadership of Turkey, can you get the beginnings of a prisoner release in exchange for a partial ceasefire that could then build momentum towards a full ceasefire and towards a demand inside Israel? And we've seen demonstrations inside Israel to prioritize prisoner release over military action.
Now, let's talk about the role that Turkey or Turkey could play. Even though President Erdogan's rhetoric in the last 24, 48 hours suggests that there is very limited. This comes back to your point, doesn't it? The public comments and the private comments. Does Turkey stand to act as an interlocutor, if not a negotiator or a mediator between the two sides? Or does that role primarily rest with Qatar?
Well, I think the Qataris have played the primary mediating role, not necessarily between the two sides, Richard. And I think what we mean here is an ability to reach into the Hamas movement and to move forward that conversation, while America, and directly with Israel, yes, but also with America, trying to see what you can get from the Israeli side. I think the expressions of the president of Turkey is also reflective of where public opinion is at. We've seen that across the region. We've seen that in Indonesia. We've seen that elsewhere. So I think, yes, we can play that role. But also America is, I think, Blinken is trying to remind people that there's the rest of the world. So Russia's on the agenda in Turkey. He then goes to Seoul, Tokyo, Delhi. China's back on the agenda there because America is bleeding focus and credibility. The longer this goes on, another reason they should push for a ceasefire.
At what point, and this isn't really a question about whether or not war crimes are being committed or questions, nice questions or fine questions, I will say, of that. But at what point does the sheer loss of civilian life make the argument that the Israeli response is not proportionate and pressure eventually generates that they have to slow down or stop?
Honestly, I think that's a question many people in the world, also in America, are asking themselves. And, you know, it's taken an Egyptian comedian, Bassem Youssef, in an interview that he once did, to perhaps capture it best. And he's saying, just tell us in advance. Is it 10,000? Is it 100,000 Palestinians? And then that's enough. But perhaps the sad answer to that question, because we've well past the phase where one can say there's some unfortunate civilian collateral. We're well past that. But maybe the sad answer to that question is only when a US administration decides that this is too costly for its domestic politics will it act in that way. And there couldn't be a bigger indictment of the administration than that, I'm afraid.
Sorry, we're almost out of time, but I do want to pick up on that point. So we'll keep going if we will. You assume in your last answer that when the US administration gets to that point, Israel will listen.
I do, because I think what we've seen here, Richard, is the extent of Israeli dependence on America. Israel has always been, you know, proudly asserting we'll defend ourselves by ourselves, but you've got this constant flow of American equipment. You've got a bill going through Congress for another 14 billion in assistance because this is wrecking the Israeli economy. And I say that because I think the density of the relationship means that even if they can't drill that message home with Netanyahu, when you have such a discredited, unpopular prime minister, you can work with the military, you can work with other cabinet ministers, coalition allies, not the most extreme ones, and you can build the walk back by Israel. And maybe Israel also has its victory narrative already. Right. A lot of blood, a lot of Palestinian fighters, in addition to the way higher number of civilians. So give that victory narrative and be done with it.
I'm grateful for your time this morning. Thank you, sir. This is CNN.
Thank you, Richard.